Well, first let me explain what I'm trying to do here, rather than try to convey this by email and conference calls. I'm doing this as a narrated, a narrated slideshow, and the intent here is to, if I were still a voting member of the Pay It Coalition, uh, I've prepared some ideas here of what I would want to hear about the shared stewardship strategy and how that session could be helpful to me. So this is assuming Undersecretary Hubbard speaks at noon on the first day. This would be a presentation by the Forest Service and probably someone from IDL. And then there are some ideas at the end for breakout sessions to continue this Idaho dialogue of how do we approach the shared stewardship strategy within Idaho and what is the role for collaborative groups. So that's the overall purpose, and hope you find this useful. I think the first thing that everybody ought to have clear in their heads is that the strategy is really focused on wildland fire environment, and in the executive summary they point out that they have a sort of a three-part sharing the stewardship of the wildland fire environment, sharing the ownership of the challenges faced by that across agencies and owners, and then sharing the commitment to do something about it. And then there are three parts to the investment strategy, the Forest Service's outcome-based investment strategy. I think the eye-opener is determining the management needs on a state level. I think that is something all the collaborators ought to understand as part of this initiative. And then the objective there is to achieve cross-boundary outcomes desired by all stakeholders. Second is doing the right work in the right place at the right time. And there's a protection theme there for communities, watersheds, and local economies. And the third part, using all available tools for active management. And I think when you read through the document that was produced at the time of the big announcement, they're really talking about the need for active management and working with partners and stakeholders to choose the right tools. There might be a sub-discussion here about administrative tools as well, like stewardship contracts versus timber sales, and maybe even EAs, EISs, and categorical exclusions. I think it's important also for collaborators to understand kind of what we're talking about in terms of investments. And so this slide, I'm saying let's take a glimpse in the rearview mirror and review over the past 10 years investments, both in terms of state and private forestry and the national forest system. For state and private, I've got three examples from their report of accomplishments produced a year ago: landscape scale restoration, wildfire mitigation, and other. Those are basically the fund accounts. And then the National Forest System, we definitely have three priority landscapes that are national priority through the CFLR. And then, as a result of the 2014 Farm Bill, the insect and disease designated landscapes. So let's begin with state and private. That's based on the IDL's Idaho Forest Assessment and then the subsequent Forest Action Plan that identified priority landscapes. The intent was to work with smaller scale local areas where you could actually do something productive in terms of evaluating the risks and the benefits. And here's a map that I'm sure everybody has seen of the priority landscapes within the state that came out of the statewide assessment. And then from the accomplishments report that IDL produced last year, here are acres treated, thinning, hazard fuel reduction, noxious weed control, and planting are the four major treatments. And it's significant dollars. Between 2008 and 2015, these are in millions. Wildfire mitigation was by far the largest amount. The landscape scale restoration, was active in several of the priority landscapes within the state. And then the other category, I think, is predominantly stimulus funds uh, that that were available the first term of the Obama administration. So the Coeur d'Alene Basin, for example, received over $2 million as part of that stimulus funding. So in summary, for that part of it, the state and private forestry has really, in the past 10 years or so, has put up an investment of $18 million. That's the federal portion of it. Each dollar has a matching requirement, so there's a non-federal match of $18 million on top of that. For national forest system priorities that set the tone for investments, we have the 3 CFLRP priority landscapes. And in round numbers, looking at the investments between 2010 and 2017, and again, these are in millions. We have 2 funds, the appropriation from Congress into the CFLR, and then there are other Washington, D.C. office funds that also have impacted or contributed to the funds in these 3 landscapes, and then the federal matching funds. So that total is almost $76 million between 2010 and 2017. And this excludes the non-federal matching that has been active in particularly in 2 of the 3 landscapes. And the third, also part of the National Forest System, are the amendments to the Healthy Forest Resource Act. So we have priority landscapes here also based on insect and disease priority. And the last I viewed it, there were 8 decisions signed and 10 in the works. And it's I don't have the information handy for the amount of federal funds that contributed to this, the amount of the investment. But looking at 1 or 2, I think it'd be safe to assume that there's at least a $500,000 investment per project. Multiplying that by 8 projects where there's a decision, I'm just estimating that there's roughly a $4 million investment since 2014, and more to come. So I think the road ahead is, well, with that perspective, the past decade, the federal investment has been $100 million in Idaho. With the new focus, or the additional focus, on shared stewardship of the wildland fire environment, what should be the strategy for the next decade? There's no guarantee there's going to be $100 million available over the next 10 years, but whatever the dollar amount is, what should be the strategy for Idaho to determine where the priorities are based on risk and what the potential benefits are? And I think the real question for those attending the conference is, what is the role of our collaborative groups in helping to shape that strategy? So with that background, I think here are just a few thoughts on breakout sessions that would continue in the afternoon. First, my perspective is that it's really important that collaborative groups understand what the potential role is of the Forest Action Plan. This shared stewardship strategy is really emphasizing developing priorities at a state level, and the Forest Action Plan is the mechanism that has been in place and updated, and there is an update going on now that defines priority landscapes and the management needs within them. So I'm suggesting that this would be an important breakout session, and the theme would sort of be, what should every collaborator know about the Forest Action Plan? And then what is the role of these priority landscapes in cross-boundary investment priorities? So that's one suggestion. The second is I think comes across pretty clear that the wildfire mitigation funds are going to be extremely important, and their role in any future restoration projects may be a primary source of funding. So I think a session on this would be relevant. And one question is there a well-defined desired cross-boundary outcome in terms of the use of these wildlife mitigation funds? And how is that important for the design of future collaborative projects, both in terms of state and private forestry investments on private land and projects of collaborative groups on the national forest system? And one other little interesting twist to this is I read in one of the minutes for the ILRCC was that there's a possibility that the wildfire mitigation funds may be moved out of the state and into the national forest system. So I would guess that means that the regional offices would play a bigger role in how those funds are allocated. So again, I think there's an important discussion point there on how that plays out in terms of collaborative projects and how does that affect the financing of those collaborative projects. And then a third topic, access. And the reason I'm suggesting this is when I think back on the Payouts' first landscape project, Mill Creek Council Mountain, 2/3 of the cost was not vegetation, but had to do with roads, either road improvements, road maintenance, and road obliteration. So I'm suggesting that that may be a relevant breakout session to discuss the importance of road access as part of the shared commitment to both fire suppression and to safety of firefighters, not only roads but also recreation trails. And this may be an important avenue to make sure other interests like recreation and watershed health can be addressed in this new management strategy. So that, in a quick nutshell, is just some suggestions for the first day, Monday afternoon session following the lunch talk, including a little introduction presentation and then some suggested topics for breakout sessions.